Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Raimundo Rios Mayo Library in Arkansas. And welcome to Strange Things. I'm your host, Chris James. This is Season 1, Episode number 24. It is October 8th, 2016. Tonight, we're going to be talking about something that I imagine most people in the audience have never heard of. It's called the Montauk Mystery. Now, it doesn't just involve Montauk. It kind of travels all up and down the East Coast. Lots of unusual connections that it took a lot of digging and a lot of work to hammer this thing out today. Now, normally, I like to follow the chronological order while telling you about a subject. However, due to the convoluted nature of this whole story, I'll just let you know what I found and not in any time frame of occurrence. That is the big problem when you're dealing with time travel. Montauk, New York, is as far east at the end of Long Island as you can get. You can't get any farther without getting wet. It is right on the water. In September 1901, Nikola Tesla began working on his electrical transmission station. And just where did he decide to build it? Just a few miles west of Montauk, Long Island. Built in 1942 and steeped in legend, the now-defunct Camp Hero is home to the towering Sage Radar Tower. It stands 120 feet tall with a 70-ton radar dish. There are numerous outbuildings, bunkers, and gun emplacements. For years, the 278-acre site stood crumbling, covered by overgrowth and completely off limits before it was finally opened to the public as a state park in 2002. Actually, though, it had been deeded as a state park back in 1984. The work had begun at Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island under the name the Phoenix Project, but it was soon realized that the project would need a large radar dish, and installing one at Brookhaven would compromise the security of the project. Having a giant radar dish mounted on the roof would not have given away any secrets of the research going on, but it would have given away their location. Luckily, the U.S. Air Force had a decommissioned base at Montauk, New York, not too far from Brookhaven, which had a complete semi-automatic ground environment, that's what SAGE stood for, radar installation. I have no idea what a semi-automatic ground environment radar dish does, but there it was. The site was large and remote, and it had water access that would allow equipment to be moved in and out without the neighbors seeing what was going on. Equipment was moved to Camp Hero at Montauk Base in the late 60s and installed in underground bunkers beneath the base. In order to mask the nature of the project, the site was closed in 1969 and donated as a wildlife refuge, with the provision that everything underground would remain the property of the Air Force. In reality, the base remained in operation until the 80s. And just what were they trying to accomplish? Well, for one, time travel. The U.S. government was trying to manipulate time. It is said that man fears time, but time fears the pyramids. The idea was someone was to be sent back in time to observe certain events, maybe tweak a few items, and then return to give a report on what they had seen. The chances of not returning were great. The poor subject might find themselves trapped in the distant past with no way to get back to their time. No one was willing to chance it, so the government would use those unable to say no. And just who was to be these voluntolds? Runaways. Young kids who had been rounded up at train stations or bus stations, and kids who had no connections to their families. Back in the 60s, kids went missing all the time. Sometimes the family was just as glad to be rid of these young'uns. Or the kid was out looking for adventure, and the family was hoping to see them again, but there was very little they could do other than notify the local authorities, who could only look around the prescribed jurisdiction. Let's face it, not everybody working for the government has as much conscience as a mushroom. It's not all that hard to find someone willing to go out and acquire test subjects needed for the Montauk Project. One such time travel mission was called Project Southern Cross. It was used to steer World War II in a more favorable direction for the Allies. What the government did was to go back in time to the 40s to help us win the war. Time travelers would deliver communications devices, weapons, and technologies made out of 1940s parts. It's not that the U.S. didn't win the war in the first place, they just didn't win it the way these people were wanting it to come out. The devices would be delivered to the constructed out of 1940s materials. These would be delivered to the 40s along with a complete set of drawings on how to make them out of 1940s parts. Wouldn't have been any good to take a laptop computer back in the 1940s because they didn't have silicone chips or flat screens or any of the necessary materials to build one. So everything that went back in time had to be recreatable in that time frame. The Voluntols also were sent back to deliver some items into Germany as well as France, which seems kind of a bizarre concept until you find out a little more about what was going on back then. So just who was capable of conducting experiments using children? Who else but Nazi scientists who had been brought to the United States during Project Paperclip. After World War II, many Nazi scientists were brought over to the U.S. through our own intelligence community. Some had formerly worked in mind control research in the concentration camps. It is believed that they are the remnant of the Nazi Party, working in conjunction with different branches of the U.S. government as well as the military. And just why would Nazi scientists help the United States win against Germany? Nazis did not pledge their allegiance to Germany. They pledged their allegiance to Adolf Hitler. If Hitler were out of the country, say in South America, then the Nazis had no real reason to help Germany. Not when all the big bucks were to be found here in the United States. Keep in mind there were those here in the United States that actually admired Hitler, and had the war not sucked the U.S. into it, they would probably have been good Nazi supporters. So Montauk began experimenting, sending kids back in time to see if it was even plausible. We're going to take a brief break right here, play a few commercials, and station identification. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, Stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Truck, 1002 Eaterby Day, suite number 7. Not a coffee drinker? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and sometimes muffins and cookies. It's a great place to meet your friends for a conversation or curl up in the corner with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Truck. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back. We're talking about the Montauk Project and some of the bizarre other projects and dealings that were associated with it. A man going by the name of Larry James, that's not his real name and he's no relative of mine, claimed to have been in charge of time travel experiments at Montauk. According to Larry, the Montauk time travel equipment was operated in the 80s. They performed several time travel experiments. Apparently, they were able to alter the outcome of the American Civil War, try out different scenarios with World War II, and go all the way back to the Roman Empire to test different outcomes. They would alter a historic event and then weigh whether or not the new outcome was better than the original. They were deciding if the new world was to their liking, even if it had disastrous outcomes for others. They soon realized that their meddling in the past was becoming a very big danger to the entire planet, so things were toned way down. He never actually said that they ceased altogether. You may ask why they never went back in time to Dealey Plaza and maybe save Kennedy's life. Well, maybe they did, or more than likely they preferred Kennedy being removed from the picture. After all, he was no fan of secret projects or those who wanted to rule the world. Now, there was Project Superman, which was also done at Montauk. There's an interview with Andy Perro, a survivor of a secret mind control project aimed at creating the super soldier with psionic abilities. The idea was to create a soldier with psychic abilities as well as superhuman strength, and thus have the ultimate army. The trouble with said army, they wouldn't necessarily hold their allegiance to the United States. They would be controlled by the men who pulled the strings. Secret organizations that most of them don't even have names. We refer to them as the Illuminati or the Bilderbergers or even the Bohemian Grove. But they don't really go by any names of their own. It would be far more accurate to call them the puppet masters. After all, they pull all the strings. The people who would tinker with others' lives to make their own better are also the kind to wipe out any or all of their past mistakes, as in killing off the super soldiers that didn't quite fulfill their expectations. Along with time travel and super soldiers, the Montauk Project was deep into mind control. Things like the Manchurian Candidate. If you don't recognize the name, you can look it up. It's all over the internet. We don't really have that much time to go into that one right now, maybe on a later show. The notion of a Manchurian Candidate is to brainwash someone into becoming a stealth agent who is willing to do anything you wanted without any knowledge of this deep-seated program. Some public official is getting too close to the truth. The puppet masters want to get rid of them. An unsuspecting individual is able to get close enough to kill the target, and then he has no memory of having done so. If the assassin survives long enough to make it into interrogation, he can only say he doesn't remember anything. The psychologists tell us you can't hypnotize a person to do things they wouldn't normally do. But how hard would it be to find somebody already predisposed towards murder? That's a tongue twister. A bank of psychological tests could be run on any group of unsuspecting men. And if somebody in the group just happened to show they have a leaning towards the ability to kill others, then he would be a top-graded test subject for this project. Now, a man named von Neumann was the inventor of the modern computer and a mathematical genius. He was able to draw on the enormous resources of the military-industrial complex, as well as the unethical findings of Nazi psychological research that the Allies had acquired after World War II. It was against this background that von Neumann attempted to couple computer technology with sophisticated radio equipment in an attempt to link people's minds with machines. Apparently, over some time, his efforts were quite successful. After years of experimentation, human thoughts could be received by radio and relayed into a computer, which could store the thoughts in terms of informational bits. This thought pattern could in turn be displayed on a computer screen and printed out on a piece of paper. These principles were developed and the techniques were enhanced until a virtual mind-reading machine was constructed. At the same time, technology was developed so that a psychic could think a thought that could be transmitted by computer and potentially affect the mind of another human being. Ultimately, the Phoenix Project obtained a superior understanding of how the mind functioned and achieved the sinister potential for mind control. A full report was made to Congress, who in turn ordered the project to be disbanded, at least in part. Congress was afraid of having their own minds controlled. And think back to the Washington Navy Yard shooting. It occurred September 16, 2013, when a lone gunman, Aaron Alexis, fatally shot 12 people and injured 3 others in a mass shooting at the headquarters of Naval Sea Systems Command, inside the Washington Navy Yard in southeast Washington, D.C. The media reported that Alexis had filed a police report in Rhode Island, August 2nd, 2013, in which he claimed to be the victim of harassment and that he was hearing voices in his head. According to an FBI official after the shooting, Alexis was under the belief that he was being controlled or influenced by extremely low-frequency electromagnetic waves. A message later obtained by federal authorities from Alexis' personal computer said, "Ultra-low-frequency attack is what I've been subject to for the last 3 months. And to be perfectly honest, that is what has driven me to this." August 4th, 2013, Naval Police were called to Alexis' hotel in Naval Station Newport and found that he had taken apart his bed, believing someone was hiding under it, and observed that Alexis had taped a microphone to the ceiling to record the voices of people that were following him. At the time of the incident, he was working for a contractor at the base. In August 23, 2013, Alexis showed up at the Providence, Rhode Island, Virginia emergency room, complaining of insomnia, and he was prescribed 50 milligrams of trazodone, a serotonin antagonist and reuptake inhibitor. On August 28th, he sought treatment for insomnia in the emergency room of a Virginia medical center in Washington, D.C. VA. And he told doctors he was not depressed and was not thinking of harming others. He was given 10 more tablets of the trazodone. At 9:15, D.C. Police Emergency Response Team officers entered the cubicle area and searched for the shooter. Eventually, the shooter jumped out from one of the desks and fired at the officers from about 5 feet away. He hit one of the officers once, right in the tactical vest, and the 3 officers returned fire. Could he have been a Manchurian candidate that was sent out as an experiment, perhaps? Or was this some weird thought process that would help the government try to do away with the Second Amendment? Back in time to the Montauk once more. The private concerns that helped to develop the project did not follow the dictates of Congress and sought to seduce the military with the idea that this technology could be used in warfare to control enemies' minds. A secret group with deep financial resources and some sort of military tie decided they would establish a new research facility at Camp Hero, the derelict Air Force Station in Montauk. This location was chosen because it housed a huge radar antenna that emitted a frequency of approximately 400 to 425 megahertz. Coincidentally, this is the same band used to enter the consciousness of the human mind. In the late 60s, the reactivated Camp Hero began despite no funding from the military. By 1972, the Montauk Project was fully underway with massive mind control experimentation being undertaken upon humans, animals, and other forms of consciousness that were deemed to exist. In other words, people from other dimensions, or perhaps ghosts, maybe even an alien or two. Over the years, the Montauk researchers perfected their mind control techniques and continued to delve further into the far reaches of the human potential. By developing a psychic ability of different personality, it eventually got to the point where a psychic's thoughts could be amplified with hardware, and illusions could be manifest both subjectively and objectively. This includes the virtual creation of matter. All of this was done unparalleled in the history of what we call ordinary human experience. But the people who ran the Montauk Project were not about to stop. They would reach even farther into the realm of the extraordinary. Once it was discovered that a psychic could manifest matter, it was observed that it could appear at different times, depending on what the psychic was thinking. Thus, what would happen if a psychic thought of a book, but he thought of it appearing yesterday? It was this line of thought and experimentation that led to the idea that one could bend time itself. After years of research, time portals were opened, with massive and outrageous experiments being conducted. The Montauk Project eventually came to a bizarre climax, with a time vortex being opened back in 1943, and the original Philadelphia experiment. None of this information would have come to light except for Preston Nichols, an electronics genius who one day discovered that he was an unwitting victim of these experiments. Working for a Long Island defense contractor, Preston was researching telepathy in psychics and found that persistent radio waves were being transmitted which were blocking the people he was working with. As a radio and electronics expert, Preston traced the radio signals directly to the Montauk Air Force Station and began an exhaustive research that lasted over a decade. He acquired much of the equipment that was used during the Montauk Project and discovered to his dismay that many people from Montauk remembered him working there. He had no memory of ever working there, and yet all these people insisted that Preston had been an employee at the Montauk Project. It all came to a culmination when his cousin's husband insisted that he'd been at Montauk. The two men almost came to blows over Preston's contention that he had never been there. Shortly after this argument, Preston began to get glimmers of a life he'd not previously been aware of. After talking to many different scientists and engineers who had some sort of association with the Montauk Project, Preston was able to put together what had happened. Somehow, he had survived on two separate timelines, or maybe two separate dimensions. On one, he worked at Montauk, but on the other, he worked at a different location. Preston's discoveries were confirmed when a strange man by the name of Duncan Cameron appeared at his door in 1985. Duncan had an uncanny aptitude for psychic research and eventually claimed to have been trained in this field by the NSA, a national security agency, also called the No Such Agency. Without mentioning his own ordeal at Montauk, Preston took Duncan out to the Camp Hero site, and he was surprised to discover that he knew the entire layout of the base, and he did remember working there. Duncan was considered to be the primary psychic used in time travel experiments, and also remembered having been aboard the USS Eldridge during the original Philadelphia experiment, along with his brother Edward, who is now known as Al Bielek. According to the accounts of both Preston and Duncan, the Montauk Project culminated on August 12, 1983. A full-blown time portal was fully functioning, but the things were out of control, and Duncan called together a group of people and decided to crash the project. While sitting in the Montauk chair, a device connected to radio receivers and studded with crystals that sent thoughts out in a giant transmitter, Duncan unleashed a giant beast from his unconscious, which literally destroyed the project. Talk about a thought creature, a genuine tulpa. The people who had been working on the base suddenly abandoned it. The air shafts and entrances to the major underground facilities beneath the base were subsequently filled with cement. The full circumstances behind all of this remained a mystery to this day. We're going to take a brief pause here. We'll be right back after these commercials, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with the Montauk Project. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Truck, 1002 Iterbide, suite number 7. Not a coffee drinker? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and sometimes muffins and cookies. It's a great place to meet your friends for a conversation or curl up in the corner with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Now, don't forget, next Saturday, the 15th anniversary Texas Bigfoot Conference kicks off in Jefferson, Texas. Meet all the people you've seen on TV. Craig Woolheater, Ken Gerhart, Nick Redfern, Lyle Blackburn, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, just to mention a few. October 15th in historic Jefferson, Texas. Make plans to attend. You don't want to miss out. The Texas Bigfoot Conference. Just look for Texas Bigfoot Research Center on your computer for more details. And also, the Laredo Paranormal Research Society would like to invite you to the second annual Mall del Norte Halloween Party, October 22nd, 2016. The LPRS will be hosting a Halloween-themed car show, a case review of some of their more spectacular investigations, and a movie, Goosebumps. Festivities will begin at 3 p.m. and finish at 11. Bring the whole family to Mall del Norte, October 22nd, 2016. And now back to the Montauk story. Yes, I know this sounds unbelievable, but so does the idea of flight, but people fly every day. Although an unauthorized video had been widely distributed regarding this story and several lectures have been given on the Montauk Project, there were no books that had come out on the subject. Different writers had attempted to document the goings-on out there, but were either mentally incapable or unwilling to deal with the subject, or they were frightened off one way or another. One science reporter from the New York Times started the project, but then he backed off when he discovered, to his own surprise, that the Montauk Project was indeed quite real. Preston Nichols got involved after he was approached by someone who wanted to pass on the story. It was either a spectacular work of nonfiction, or it was at least the best science fiction book he had ever read. After several months, it was decided to undertake writing the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. That book was written without consulting anyone other than Preston, who wanted to protect his sources. Rather than do a costly and time-consuming investigation, the strategy was to get the information out as fast as possible and use the book to gather other clues that would corroborate or eventually prove the existence of this incredible story. Preston was banking on the hope that someone who had been at Montauk would read his book and be encouraged to come forward and corroborate the bizarre details in the book. As the Montauk Project was published, further research and events continued that would indeed establish that there was a real scenario behind the wild information Preston was talking about. These were chronicled in the Montauk Revisited. However, the most spectacular of all these corroborations was the discovery that the Montauk Project was inextricably linked to the most infamous occultist of all time, Aleister Crowley, often described as the wickedest man in the world. According to reports, Crowley himself had used the practice of sexual magic in order to manipulate time itself, communicate with disembodied entities, and to travel interdimensionally. It was even suggested that the interdimensional nature of the Philadelphia experiment could have been the outward expression of Crowley's magical operations. The startling proof of Crowley's association developed over a long period of time, but the discovery began to take shape in the first conversation with Preston when he seemed to blurt out of the blue that he was connected to the magician Aleister Crowley. In an earlier life, he believed that both he and Duncan had been Preston and Marcus Wilson, respectively. These brothers were twins and had been the first manufacturers of scientific instruments in Great Britain, in addition to being friends of Aleister Crowley's family. They had also been involved in a joint business enterprise with them. This sounds like reincarnation. Some refuse to believe this is possible. I'll have to do a show on reincarnation sometime soon. All the above sounds like one more wild story, so the writer began to look for any references to the Wilsons in Aleister Crowley's various books. None turned up. To his surprise, though, he discovered that not only had Crowley visited Montauk in 1918, but he had mentioned a Duncan Cameron in his autobiography. Subsequent to this, numerous instances of synchronicity between Cameron and Crowley families were discovered. These are detailed in the Montauk Revisited, but he still couldn't find any references to the Wilson brothers. The meaning of these various synchronicities between the Camerons and the Crowleys began to be explained when he found out about a woman who called herself Cameron. She is perhaps most famous for having been married to Jack Parsons, the world's first solid fuel rocket scientist and a disciple of Crowley. He's also the founder of Jet Propulsion Laboratories out in California, a branch of NASA. Together, they had participated in an interdimensional activity known as the Babylon Working, a ceremonial act which included sex magic and had been hailed by some as the greatest magical act of the century. Cameron and Parsons were attempting to create a homunculus, a kind of a soulless being that would do anything they wished. It now became obvious that Preston's story about being a Wilson could not be discounted, nor could his general credibility be denied. Perhaps more importantly, it revealed that some very strange correspondences were at work that had to do with interdimensionality. Now, Preston Nichols would receive an astonishing letter several months later that would close the case as regards to whether or not the Wilson brothers had existed. It was from a man named Amado Crowley, who claimed to be an illegitimate son of Aleister Crowley. Not only did he remember his father talking about the Wilson brothers, but he also provided clues which revealed that the odds of his lying about his parentage were nil. Amado not only verified the existence of the Wilson brothers, he gave a spectacular account of his father's whereabouts on August 12, 1943, the day of the Philadelphia experiment. Aleister had directed a magical ceremony at Menon Toll in Cornwall, England, where a large donut-shaped rock stands upright in the water. According to Amado, Aleister stepped through the hole in the rock. A line appeared in the water, running straight towards Long Island. For the most part, this is where the book of the Montauk Revisited ends. Amazing discoveries were made which showed that Preston was not off his rocker and his general line of reasoning was valid. That is what this book was meant to do. Additionally, it showed that the forces which manifest the Montauk Project were deeply entrenched in the occult. If you find this fascinating and want more, check out the Montauk Project and Montauk Revisited by Preston Nichols Of course, it's available at Amazon.com. Now, the history of the Montauk Project is directly related to the Philadelphia experiment, also known as Project Rainbow, which took place in 1943. Nikola Tesla had nearly been killed while working with massive amounts of electricity that flung him into a kind of a trans-dimensional state. During this time, he saw images from the past as well as from the future. Tesla believed he had been given a brief trip through time. Albert Einstein concluded in his later years that the past, the present, and the future all existed simultaneously. Such luminaries as Albert Einstein and Nikola Tesla were working together to try to make a Navy ship invisible to radar, if not also invisible to the eye as well. The idea being to bend light around the ship, making it invisible because the image of the ocean beyond would encircle the ship. The experiment was based on an aspect of Einstein's unified field theory, the interrelated nature of the forces that comprise electromagnetic radiation and gravity. In other words, uniting the fields of electromagnetism and gravity into a single field. Such researchers thought that some version of this field would enable using large electrical generators to bend light around an object via refraction so that the object became completely invisible. The Navy regarded this as a military value, and for this reason they sponsored the experiments. So the task of degaussing the ship and thus hiding from the enemy would make a fleet of ships able to cross the Atlantic or the Pacific during the war without anyone knowing they were there. The U.S. Eldridge was the guinea pig in this story. The destroyer escort was rigged out with massive power generators, and the hull was lined with power cords. When it was time to test the cloaking device, the Eldridge sailed out into the harbor and the big switch was thrown. Those observing the experiment from a safe distance said the ship vanished from sight, as was planned. But then they noticed the water should have shown the outline of the hull. Just because the ship was invisible, it should still be displacing water. The ship wasn't invisible. It was gone. The Eldridge was somehow passing through time and space with no way of controlling it. Two members of the crew, Ed Cameron, along with his brother Duncan, thought the ship was about to blow up, so they jumped over the rail. They landed at the Montauk in the year 1983. The Eldridge was now trapped in some kind of a time storm. It was decided that the two crewmen needed to get back on board their ship and shut down or destroy the generators so the ship could hopefully return to 1943. Yes, I know this sounds fantastic and impossible. If you ask the government, they will say it never happened. It's not like the government would never lie to us, right? The good news is that the Eldridge did, in fact, return to the waters off the coast of Philadelphia. Unfortunately, some of the crew were permanently fused to the ship. It was as if they had been forced into the steel superstructure. These men were doomed to die since most of their vital organs were now 50% steel. Others had gone insane, as if the trip through time had unhinged them. These men were whisked away to live out the remainders of their lives locked in some government hospital. As for Ed, he was somehow regressed to the year 1927 and reassigned as Al Bielek. This new Al grew up not knowing he had just lived a life involved in this tremendous experiment that may still be going on today. Not only was he given a new life, he was given a new body as well. he had to go through adolescence all over again. He eventually began to regain his memories from the other life. Al Billick was on Coast to Coast AM as well as many other radio shows. Now, sometime in the 1950s, some of the researchers from the original Project Rainbow, also known as the Philadelphia Experiment, began to look into their former project with an eye to continue their research. They wanted to see if the technical aspects of manipulating the electromagnetic shell that had been used to make the USS Eldridge invisible. They also wanted to look into the possible military application of psychological effects of the magnetic field. Remember all those sailors who were deemed to be driven insane on board the Eldridge? They thought this would make a good weapon during a time of war. Yes, this sounds insane. The scientists have always been so intent on what they thought they could do, they seldom asked if it was safe or not. Just before the atomic bomb test at White Sands went off in 1945, there was the question of whether the bomb would cause the ionosphere to burst into flames and kill every living person on Earth. They flipped the switch anyway. They were more intent on seeing what they could do rather than asking themselves, is this a safe, rational, good thing to do? We're going to take a brief pause here. We'll be right back after these commercial messages and a brief station identification. So don't go away. We'll be right back. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Truck, 1002 Iturbide, suite number 7. Not a coffee drinker? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and sometimes muffins and cookies. It's a great place to meet your friends for a conversation or curl up in the corner with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Don't forget, the 15th anniversary Texas Bigfoot Conference is coming up just next Saturday, October 15th in historic Jefferson, Texas. Make plans to attend. You don't want to miss out. The Texas Bigfoot Conference. Just look for Texas Bigfoot Research Center on your computer for more details. Now, back to the Montauk Project some more. A report was prepared and presented to the United States Congress and was soundly rejected as being far too dangerous. So a proposal was made directly to the United States Department of Defense, promising a powerful new weapon that could drive an enemy insane, inducing the symptoms of schizophrenia at the touch of a button. Without congressional approval, the project would have to be top secret, and it would have to receive secret funding. The Department of Defense approved. One source says funding supposedly came from a catch of $10 billion in Nazi gold recovered from a train found by U.S. soldiers in a train tunnel in France. The Nazi scientists working at Montauk may have known the location of the gold train and reasoned it would be a good use for these ill-gotten gains. Or maybe this was some of the millions of tax dollars that go missing each year. When those funds ran out, additional funding was secured from IT&T and Krupp AG in Germany. There seemed to be lots of German connections to the Montauk Project as well as the Philadelphia story. The out-of-this-world electronics genius, John Hutchison, lives up in Canada. He's trying to recreate the Philadelphia experiment. If anybody can do it, it would be him. He's the same man that levitated a cannonball using a magnetic field, and as well as melted metal in most bizarre way. If you're on the internet and want to take a look, just type in the Hutchinson effect and prepare to have your mind slightly bent. The man is something else. Now, something to think about when it comes to time travel. Think back. Do you recall hearing about someone dying? Some celebrity that you knew from TV or the movies? Maybe it was some world leader who seemed to own half of the planet. And then later you see him acting in a new movie or perhaps on the news. Queen Elizabeth, they call her the Queen Mother, her death was announced in the Australian media in 1993. As the crowds began to mourn her passing, it came to light she wasn't dead after all. She did finally die, but in 2002, at 102 years of age. Queen Elizabeth II, her death was announced on the BBC radio in West Midland on May 17, 2010. And then she shows up very much alive once again. And she's still going at the age of 90. Ghazali Safi, foreign minister of Malaysia, was reported by the New York Times to have died in an airplane crash in 1982. And once again, he turns up alive just a short time later. And of course, there's a lot of people's favorite, Paul McCartney, who was proclaimed dead in 1969. Then, there he is, still breathing, and yet there are lots of people out there who remember the report of him dying. Just imagine if they had actually died, and then someone, for some mysterious reason, slipped back in time to change the events for whatever unknown reason. You might think time travel is impossible. However, Albert Einstein said time travel wasn't an impossibility as far as physics was concerned. There's a scene from a Charlie Chaplin film in 1938 where it looks like the person walking through the frame is talking on a cell phone. I watched the clip a dozen times. It looks just like the woman is holding a cell phone. I can't think of any reason she would be holding her right hand up to the side of her head as she walks along the street. And then there's the story from Times Square. A man in his early 30s named Rudolph Fentz was hit by a taxi and killed in June 1950. He was dressed in the fashions of the late 1800s. In his pockets, police found receipts and papers, all from the 1800s. A New York Police Department investigation found a report of a man that had disappeared in 1876 at the age of 29. Could Rudolph Fentz have been one of the kids sent back to the 1800s, and then he was brought forward only to die by taxi in the 1950s? In March 2006, a man was arrested for insider trading. He had started with $800 and managed to turn that into a measly $350 million. He told authorities he had come back in time from 200 years in the future. The police were not believing a word of it, but they said they were going to keep him in jail until he gave up the names of his co-conspirators. While awaiting his arraignment, he vanished from his cell. No one could figure out how, so to fix the problem, they simply made his records vanish. The only records left are the newspaper clippings that had been stashed away during the investigation. His name was Andrew Carlson. Carlson is spelled Carlssin, if you want to give him a search on the internet. You can see the newspaper reports, you'll just never see the police file. The story gives me the impression that perhaps in the future the equipment used for time travel isn't quite as secret as it is today. Now, there are those who say MJ-12 is very much involved in mind control and not so much as an experiment. MJ-12 is supposed to be pulling the strings that control the men that killed several leaders: John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. They were all shot, but the question of by whom has become a complex uncertainty. Then there's the problem as to why the investigations were all screwed up. That's the question of who was really to blame came up in the first place. The detectives investigating John Kennedy's death just put one of the bullets in his pocket. Never mind chain of evidence. The body was removed from Parkland Hospital at gunpoint. Robert Kennedy was shot in the back, but Sirhan was standing in front of him. And the hotel where Martin Luther King was shot had trees and brush removed just after the shooting, but before the investigation had started. And how about the new implant being offered as a quick and easy means of patient identification? Is that really all they can do? Just because the implant is in your arm or your leg, doctors are not too sure just how the mind works. Memories seem to be stored in the body as well as in the mind. A new form of birth control being tried out in Africa right now is supposed to be made possible by simply injecting the implant into the subject and thus preventing inception. Supposedly, the patient can turn birth control on or off with a computer program. Just flip a switch and kids will be born. Who really knows what all kinds of bodily control is being affected by this tiny implant? Is there a possibility of their minds being taken over and their will becoming the will of someone else? And Dr. Joseph Mengele of Auschwitz notoriety was the principal developer of the trauma-based Montauk Project, which led to the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control program. Mengele and approximately 5,000 other high-ranking Nazis escaped the Allies and either wound up in South America or some were brought here to the United States under Operation Paperclip. The Nazis continued their work in developing mind control and rocketry technology in secret underground military bases. The only thing we were told about was the rocketry work with the former Nazi star Werner von Braun. The killers, torturers, and mutilators of innocent humans beings were kept discreetly out of sight, but busy in U.S. underground military facilities such as Camp Hero, which gradually became home to thousands upon thousands of kidnapped children, snatched off the streets, who were destined for either mind control experiments or time travel. The graduates would be used as assassins. Now the failures would simply disappear. Now think back about some of the weird news reports you've heard about people suddenly going crazy or killing or committing crimes that made no sense? Could some, if not all, have been scientific experiments that were either used to see if things were working properly, or maybe the subject had somehow wandered away from their handlers and he needed to be wrapped up? In other words, killed. Just because this sounds inhuman, so did all those experiments conducted by the Nazis in Europe, as well as the Japanese in China, and the CIA here in the United States. LSD was given to unsuspecting test subjects. Patients were given shock treatment until their minds were wiped clean. The world is a stage for some, but others consider it their test lab. And that's it for the Montauk Project today. I hope you enjoyed the story. There's far more to it than what I've been able to give you, so if you'd like to check it out for yourself, be my guest. Remember those 2 books by Preston. Next Saturday, we'll be talking about the puppet masters, those who pulled the strings in order to make the world their own. Until then, I hope you enjoy our show, Strange Things. I am Chris James, and we'll be back next Saturday.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.